It is a gift to be with you. I've followed the work and the ministry of Spero Day for a long time, so it's good to be here. I live in New York City now, and folks who go to churches like yours and churches like I'm a part of in New York, we know each other exists because there's not a lot of us out there, and so thank you for letting me be here. In a world where too many churches are bastions of guilt and shame, in a state that is struggling to discern the difference between justice and bigotry, in a city that I think is desperate in its need for supernatural love and compassion and peace, I couldn't be more grateful that you exist and that you would let me be here with you today. The text that we will be teaching on today is Luke chapter 8, verses 22 through 25, and I'd love to read that and then just reflect on it with you. One day, Jesus got into a boat with his disciples, and he said to them, "Let us go across to the other side of the lake." And so they put out, and while they were sailing, he fell asleep. And a windstorm swept down onto the lake, and the boat was filling with water, and they were in danger. And they went to him and woke him up, shouting, "Master, Master, we are perishing." And waking up, Jesus rebuked the wind and the raging waves, and they ceased, and there was a calm. And then he said to them, "Where is your faith?" And they were terrified and amazed, and said to one another, "Who then is this, that he commands even the winds and the water, and they obey him?" Let's pray. Come, Holy Ghost, our souls inspire and illuminate us with your cosmic fire. For if you are with us, then nothing else matters. And if you are not with us, then nothing else matters. In the name of Christ, we ask these things. Amen.
I speak my truth in love. I sing my truth in love. I walk in truth, I dream in truth. I am the truth of love.
Well, in the 20th century, one of the most influential psychologists in the world, a guy named Paul Ekman, identified 6 basic emotions: anger, disgust, happiness, sadness, surprise, and fear. But it was the last emotion, fear, that turned out to be the most basic of all of them. So primitive, in fact, that even lower life forms, even lizards, seem to feel it. But even though fear is an emotion that we all feel, there's this sense of shame that's attached to it, which is why we camouflage our fears, deny our fears, downplay our fears, and hide them from public view. I know a little something about these tactics because I spent the first 3 decades of my life living in the grip of fear and successfully hiding it from nearly everyone I knew. By most American standards, my 20s had been a roaring success. I graduated from college. I'd earned 2 graduate degrees. I bought my first home. My career was taking off. I had written and published a couple of books. I'd even managed to save enough money to take this holy grail of a dream vacation so many of us think about. On the outside, things seemed perfect. Oh, but underneath that facade was a frightened little boy. Now, if you had hooked me up to a lie detector test back then, well, then I might have had no choice but to tell you I was gay. I'd known this since at least middle school, though I'd never had the courage to use that word, even in private. I treated being gay like it was highly classified intel, as if lives depended upon me keeping it a secret, and, well, I thought at least one life did, mine. So I kept this secret under lock and key, and I had plenty of good reasons to do so. You see, I grew up in the 1980s, which means I came of age in the era of Teddy Ruxpin and Rubik's Cubes, Walkmans and mixtapes, reading Rainbow and Rainbow Bright. But being born in the 1980s also meant I came of age in the height of the American AIDS epidemic. So as a child, I was inundated with stories, terrible stories, nightmarish stories about what would happen to people like me who embraced who we were. News outlets showed me clips of emaciated men in hospital beds languishing from a disease we were told was a death sentence. My health class teacher told me awful stories about this so-called gay disease that would kill me if any of us dared to come out. As the middle son of a Southern Baptist preacher, my faith community also had some things to say. Abomination was the most electric word I remember, and while I don't fully think I understood what it meant at the time, I knew it was an awful thing to be. I'd heard stories about what God did to abominations. He sent them to hell, of course. There were also stories that arose from within, doomsday scenarios about what would happen to me if I ever came out. Oh, I rehearsed these more times than I can recall. I imagined how my family would disown me, how my friends would reject me, how my church would shun me, how I would be totally, utterly alone. If I came out, or if one of the few people who knew decided to push me out, I was convinced I would perish. And so I lived under the tyranny of terror, hamstrung by fear. What are you afraid of? What is the thing that wakes you up at 4:30 in the morning and makes you walk your dog? When your mind wanders and the voices whisper, what do those voices talk to you about? If you were to sit down and make a list of your most worrisome worries, what would you scribble at the top? And here's a deeper question. Which stories are you telling yourself that are fueling your fears? Well, if even asking those questions raises your blood pressure, you might want to take a little boat ride with a man named Luke, a gospeler, across a sea called Galilee. You see, today's story is a famous one, and we know it must have something important to say to us because 3 out of the 4 gospel writers made sure to include it in their books. Each one puts their own unique spin on the story, but the basic contours are the same. It's immediately obvious to us that the story is at least partly about fear, but if I asked you to identify where fear shows up, I bet you'd point your finger straight at the storm. And yet, the fear-inducing stories are flowing in long before the first rain clouds form. You see, earlier in the chapter, Jesus and his disciples have been crisscrossing the Judean countryside, and the crowd following along has gotten so deep and so dense that even his own mother and brothers can't manage to elbow their way to the front of the line. Finally, Jesus and the disciples reach the western shore of the Sea of Galilee, and Jesus decides to charter a boat and cross over to the other side. Now, if you were a religious Jew living in first century Palestine like Jesus' disciples, the thought of crossing to the other side of the lake, that would send chills up your spine. Because that would mean entering the Decapolis, a federation of 10 cities incorporated by the Roman general Pompey in 63 BC as outpost of Hellenism and paganism, to evangelize the region with Greco-Roman ideals and choke out the Palestinian Jewish culture. A journey to the Decapolis was a journey to Mordor. No self-respecting Jew dared to go there. The disciples had grown up hearing stories about this place, this awful place, sitting around campfires and at dinner tables from the rabbis at their synagogue. They had been warned that the Decapolis was populated with pagan temples consecrated to forbidden idols. It was rumored to be the epicenter of demonic energy, a place where evil spirits roamed the countryside and possessed passersby. Its residents glorified violence and greed and practiced child sacrifice. Its farmers raised pigs, an animal Palestinian Jews considered unclean, and most had never even seen before. Every Jewish mother had warned her children to avoid the Decapolis at all costs. So when Jesus steps up onto this fishing boat and decides to set sail for the Decapolis, well, the disciples begin to feel the fear rising, not because they're in any imminent danger, but because they are being swept up in a fearful story about what happens to someone who dares to cross to the other side. But here's a question. Why would Jesus want to take them there anyway? I mean, why would Jesus lead his disciples to a frightening place when he could have chosen any other number of towns to visit? Well, who can say for sure? Not me. But I can tell you something about the Christian life that almost nobody will warn you about when you first sign up for it. Jesus has a habit of leading people to scary places. It happens time and again in the Gospels, and it seems to be true with a lot of his more modern disciples as well, so it seems pretty obvious to me at least, that for whatever reason, Jesus wants us to learn to face our fears. And from one angle, that might seem like some kind of spiritual masochism, but from another, well, it just looks like good practice, good preparation, because in the end, life will force all of us to go to places that will send shivers up our spines, whether we like it or not. You may find yourself standing in a funeral home of the only lover who ever loved you back. Or maybe you'll be asked to clean out the closets in your now vacant childhood home. Your parents' house, that place where you experienced some of your worst traumas. Those of us who are lucky to live long enough will be wheeled into a nursing home or transferred to an oncology ward or sent to a hospice center. That's just life. Truly, I tell you, Jesus said in John 21, when you were younger, you dressed yourself and you went where you wanted, but when you are old, you will stretch out your hands and someone else will dress you and lead you where you do not want to go. Sounds like good practice to me. But somehow in our story, the disciples muster enough nerve to board that boat. And that's when things get even scarier. According to Luke's story, at least, the ship is sailing across the water, and suddenly, the text says, a windstorm came down on the lake. The wording sounds strange, at least at first, until you know a little something about the region's topography. The Lake of Galilee, as Luke's Gentile readers would have called it, is surrounded by ravine-marked hills that act like wind tunnels, pulling strong winds across the water and stirring up storms. And while those surrounding hills tower at up to 2,000 feet, the sea sits deep down in the valley at nearly 700 feet below sea level. So when these strong winds combine with the pressure differentials and the dramatic temperature drop, it can supercharge a storm. And right on cue, the stories start coming. You see, the storms of Galilee were infamous. Ancient documents and fishing boat charters from this era, this time period, include serious warnings about these storms. And the disciples, they're all local to this region, not to mention that 4 of them were actually fishermen, so they are quite familiar with these stories. They've heard stories about fishing vessels that have capsized. They've heard stories about sailors that have drowned. So when the clouds darken and gather, the knots in their stomachs tighten. When the thunder cracks and the rains begin to fall, their heartbeats quicken. When the winds whip and the lightning strobes, fear steps behind the wheel, and the disciples rush to rouse Jesus. See what they say: "Master, Master, we are perishing." You know, the disciples are so confident they're going to die, you wonder why they even bothered to wake him up. Let the man sleep if the whole thing's been settled. The disciples say, "Master, we are perishing," not "we could perish" or "we might perish." Oh no, they know exactly where this is heading. You know, that's the thing about fear. Fear is a fortune teller. It's in the business of predicting the future. That's how fear works. That's what fear does. It tells you where everything's heading. And its catastrophic predictions are usually stated with confidence, if not certainty. The disciples are certain they're going to perish. But fear's prediction, as it turns out, was off. Jesus awakes, and he turns toward the storm, and he rises up to his full height to confront it. And the master's arms stretch out over the water, and the dark storm clouds peel back like the tin top of a sardine can, and there was calm. Fear is a fortune teller, but like most fortune tellers, fear is notoriously wrong. According to researchers at Penn State University, only about 8% of the things that people worry about come true. 8%. That means if right now you are freaking out and catastrophizing about something, the future that you are afraid of is almost certain never to come true. Not in the way you foresee it, not along the timeline you're forecasting it, not with the results that you're expecting it. When it comes to the way humans have evolved to experience fear, there's a little bit of a flaw in the system. You see, from the time you're born, you begin hearing and overhearing stories from your family and your church and your community. And your brain logs these stories, especially the ones that you hear over and over and over, into a kind of library in your mind. And these stories become a lens. They shape how you see the world. Those stories are how we humans make meaning. We are storytelling creatures. When you experience fear, and fear attempts to forecast the future, it's not using a crystal ball or tea leaves. It's using all that information that's been collected in your internal story bank in order to make its prediction. You can probably already see the flaws, but there's more. While we are a storytelling species, we're also the imperfect narrators of our own lives. Because there's something you've probably heard of called negativity bias, which is just a fancy word to describe our brain's tendency to hold on to negative details in stories more easily than positive or neutral ones. Now, from an evolutionary perspective, this is a primitive survival instinct meant to keep us alive. But in a world like ours, where we aren't running from saber-toothed tigers, it doesn't always serve us well. So our internal story bank is skewed toward negativity, which is why fear often overinflates the implications of a threat and also fails to consider conflicting data. Fear will almost never take into account your strength, your resilience, your endurance, your ability to cope with unforeseen circumstances, which will almost always show up if that storm you fear comes along. Fear will also typically fail to account for the potential that God's grace and presence will meet us in our circumstances, which is exactly what happens in today's story. And the disciples, like so many of us, never saw it coming. So they marveled, saying to one another, "Who then is this that he commands, even winds and water, and they obey him?" In the first century, when pagans told stories of nature miracles, they almost always assigned them to the gods. And the same was actually true in the Jewish imagination. In the story of Jonah, for example, which is strikingly similar to today's story, God stills the storm. As the psalmist lyrically reminds us, it is God that the seas obey. It is God who calms the wave. It is God who guides ships to safe harbor. So when Jesus calms the storm, the disciples realize that their master is more than a mere human performing a magic trick. He is manifesting divine traits. This Jesus that they have been following is the undistilled, undistorted image of God right there in their midst. And as the light bulbs above their head illuminate, they ask a question. Listen, who is this? And maybe you see it here, a shift in perspective, a new concern, a different primary interest. Do you see it? Suddenly, the disciples are less focused on what is happening to them and more concerned with who is happening among them. Now, I can only speak for myself here, but I will say in times of great fear, my attention is consumed by the terrible, horrible what. I've lost my job, that's what. My partner packed up and left, that's what. The cancer has come back, that's what. And the scary things in our lives matter. Please hear me on that. They matter, and they matter so much. But fear will tell you they are the only things that matter. And I think that Luke, the gospeler, has come to us with this tale this morning to remind us that there's something else we have to pay attention to in moments of fear, someone else we need to pay attention to, that no matter where we are sailing, the great divine is in the boat. That no matter what we're facing, the great divine is in the storm. That God was with you on the western shore that felt like home, and you've had to leave behind. And that God will be on the eastern shores, that place you never wanted to go when you arrive. The Franciscan author, Father Richard Rohr, reminds us that all spiritual teachings and all spiritual traditions, including Christianity and perhaps especially Buddhism, are trying to teach us the same thing, which is this: to be present to the presence of God. It's that simple. But the problem is, we're almost always somewhere else. We're either reprocessing the past or we're worrying about the future. But as Rohr writes, the presence of God is infinite, everywhere, always and forever. You cannot not be in the presence of God. There's no other place to be. The only change is on our side. God is present, but we're not present to the presence. If you want to try a spiritual practice, try practicing being present to the presence. It's a great practice. And the best part about it is that it can take on so many forms. Sometimes it can look like stillness. Just stopping in your tracks and letting the spinning earth do all the work for you. Be still and know that I am God, the psalmist says. Sometimes it can look like breathing. Just sitting like we did a moment ago and centering on your breath, ruah, breath, life, spirit. Breathing the breath that breathed the world. Sometimes it can look like remembering, just setting aside times to recall all the moments that rattled your bones, and yet somehow you found the strength to cope with the unexpected, or you encountered God's grace in the midst of that bygone storm. And if all of this sounds like too much work, you can just practice the presence by simply opening your eyes, keeping your eyes peeled to what's happening in your midst right now. Right now, the many miracles that are happening in the middle of your storm, present miracles that your past fear never accounted for. Yes, miracles, I know. It's a fraught word for good progressives and modern thinkers like us. Believing in miracles sounds a lot like magical thinking to our enlightened minds. I get it. I live in New York City, and the moment that I start talking about miracles to most of my friends, I can tell they want to raise their hand and interrupt me. They want to tell me they don't believe in miracles. They've never experienced such things. Oh, but then they start talking about their lives, like their actual lives. And it seems pretty clear to me that they have a lot of experience in these sorts of things. They just didn't have a name for what was happening to them. Or maybe they called them by another name, like coincidence or serendipity or good luck. My friend Eric has been estranged from his mother for nearly 20 years, but he was afraid that they would never reconcile. But recently, he got a text with an apology out of the blue. It's not a solution, but it's a start. A girlfriend of mine got a divorce a few years ago, and she thought it would be the end of her life. Then one day, she opened her curtains and made her bed, and she accomplished all sorts of things she never knew she was capable of. My cousin lost his dream job. Then he learned he could live without it. A checkout clerk offers you a needed encouragement. A stranger shows you an uncommon kindness in a time of need. A friend of yours reaches out and gives you a hug when the thing you need most is human touch. Whatever you call them, these are the kinds of things that can peel back the clouds and give you peace. Not just peace from the storm, but peace for the storm. So call them whatever you like, because the most important thing is not that we name them, but that we notice them. That we attune our awareness to spot them and remember them, and then remind ourselves of them later on so that we won't forget that they are always happening to us, even in the middle of storms, especially in the middle of storms. July of 2012, weeks before my 30th birthday, my boat pushed off the western shore and the bottom fell out of the sky. I was thrust into the place that I feared the most. A former friend of mine, someone that I had trusted with so many secrets, with too many secrets, publicly outed me for being gay. In many ways, it was just as awful as I expected it to be. My family interactions turned awkward and chilly. I was asked to stand in front of the church where I was a teaching pastor and explain myself. Many of my professional opportunities with Christian organizations just dried up. Some of my friends told me they were weirded out and needed some time to process. Most of them never came back. Others were angry and hurt at me, blaming me for not trusting them enough to let them in on my secret. In the aftermath of this trauma, I hated everything. I hated my life, and I hated this body, and I hated all the choices that I had made that had put me in this situation, and I hated the person who'd done this to me. I remember how every night for weeks, I would fall into bed already emotionally exhausted, and I would wail into my pillowcase until it was warm and wet. On those nights, I learned there are so many different kinds of tears. I cried tears of sadness, and tears of confusion, and tears of rage. And then when I ran out of different kinds of tears to cry, I'd just lay awake pondering the black hole of uncertainty that was now my future. You know, I wouldn't wish being outed on my worst enemy. I wouldn't wish it on the evilest person on planet Earth. It split my life open like firewood and set it ablaze. It was awful. And also, I had conversations that were long overdue. And I found the courage to shake loose some words that had been lodged in my throat for far too long. And also, many of my old friends offered me love and acceptance with no strings attached. And a couple of new friends showed up and helped me take the next labored step. And also, I remember waking up one morning and noticing something, noticing that my chest had filled with a new sense of beginning, of new opportunity, of new possibility about what my life could be. And I sat that morning and felt the love of God who likes me just the way I am. And I practiced the presence. And that was the morning I noticed I was no longer afraid. I was free. I can't predict the future, and neither can you. The thing you fear the most may happen. It may already be happening. And whenever it comes, it will likely be painful, and it will involve loss and uncertainty and grief. And also, you may find strength you didn't know you had. And also, unlikely helpers may show up at just the right moments, and also you may learn that you didn't need the thing you lost after all. And also you may find yourself drawn into God's presence and grace and love in a way that you couldn't even fathom. I don't know what's coming for you or what has already come for you, but I do know that fear's forecast can't often be trusted. I know you're likely stronger than you believe, more resilient than you think, better able to cope than you assume, and I trust that somewhere in your terrible what, there is an almighty who's working to bring forth marvelous things. Yes, even things that good modern thinkers like us might just call a miracle. Amen.
Looks like we made it. Look how far we've come, my baby. I'm not I took the long way, but we knew we'd get there someday. They said make it, but just look at us holding on. We're still together, still going strong. Still the one, you're still the one I run to, the one that I belong to. You're still the one I want for life. You're still the one, you're still the one that I love, the only one I dream of. Still the one I kiss goodnight. Still the one, ain't nothing better. We beat the odds together. I'm glad we didn't listen. Look at what